frauds with technology, supported by Invest India and Startup India. My name is Sriraj Deshmukh, and I will be your host for this session. We would like to thank our session partner Refinitiv, Gold Partner Reactor, Gold Partner Netherlands Embassy, Gold Partner Cybersprint, Bronze Partner Onfido, and Knowledge Partner EY. We are now moving on to our next keynote session on financial services digital innovation, data protection imperatives. I would like to welcome Mr. Deval, who is the Managing Director Asia Pacific at Utimaco GmbH. I would request Mr. Sheth to take over from here and kickstart this session.
Hey, thank you, Sriraj. So it's my pleasure to be a moderator and an introducer of our next panelist. I'm happy to welcome Ms. Rama Vedashree as a keynote speaker. Most of you will know her, but just to introduce her, Ms. Rama Vedashree is the CEO of the Data Council of India. She has also been associated with NASSCOM under several capacities. She is represented in many committees of Government of India, including the Data Protection Committee, and she is the perfect speaker for having that we have today. Without any further ado, I hand over the session to Rama. Welcome, ma'am. Over to you.
Thank you, Deval. First of all, a good afternoon to all the delegates who have joined us in this Pursuit conference hosted by IMI. I would like to thank IMI and Dr. Shubho and team for inviting me for this first conference that they're hosting. It's always a pleasure to talk to professionals from the industry, and I also see a great mix of audience and speakers from the financial services and fintech industry. So thank you for the opportunity. So I would be focusing the session around the kind of digital innovation and platformization and mainstreaming of emerging technologies that is happening in the financial services world, particularly with the way the fintechs are innovating, and what are the data protection imperatives. And at the end of the session, the key takeaway I would like the audience to have is not to look at data protection imperatives from a compliance mindset or a regulatory mindset, but look at it from a perspective of winning consumer trust and retaining consumer trust. I think if you have a consumer trust-led approach to data protection and privacy, we are better off than having a compliance mindset. And one answer I will definitely not have at the end of my session is, which is what several people ask me in conferences or even in any other meetings, on when can we expect the PDP bill to be passed in Parliament. Your guess is as good as mine. Even I'm waiting to hear about it. So I don't have any answers on that, unfortunately. So if you look at overall in the financial services sector in India and globally, and more so in India actually, India is definitely leading the playbook for technology-led financial inclusion. So if you look at the entire, while India has been talking about a lot about socio-economic inclusion and financial inclusions over several years, the way technology has accelerated financial inclusion, particularly in the last 3-4 years, I think we are really becoming the playbook for the world. And organizations like NPCI, all the banks, the fintechs, all the payment banks, whether it's the global platform companies, and a lot of the Indian fintechs have contributed, and of course the vision of the government of India. Particularly if you see in the financial services sector, I think, I mean, I'm not really getting into all of that. A very important thing that we are seeing is several competitors collaborating together. And there is a very strong sense of not just competition, but a lot of cooperation and competition. A very unique mix of players coming together to offer a service to the consumer, whether it is in the insurance world, financial services world, digital payments, lending, right, microfinance. You see several different kinds of institutions coming together to be able to create a new service offering, and all of that is actually based on technology. And we are also beginning to see the way AI and big data is getting mainstream to be able to create new products and services and accelerate the go-to-market time and have very targeted, hyper-personalized services based on the constituents that you want to serve, or a geography you want to serve, or a certain socioeconomic strata that the provider wants to serve, or it could be just somebody wanting to serve the young millennials. And when we look at all of this, any fintech or financial services organization is now a technology-led organization and also a data-rich organization. We are not, if you look at any of the new fintechs who have really started flourishing in the last 4-5 years, and we're seeing many of them really seeing an up curve, particularly post-COVID, where everybody is obviously compelled to consume services online, transact online, pay online. That has really increased multiple folds post-COVID, thanks to all the lockdowns. The organizations are all maybe very capital light, but very data rich, which means everything is happening around data, innovating on data, your new service offerings, your targeted customer onboarding, customers acquisition or consumer acquisition is all based on data and whatever analytics you're able to do. Another interesting thing why whether the security concerns or data protection concerns come is everything in the financial services world, thanks to the innovation from the fintechs, and the platform companies to a certain extent, and organizations like NPCI who have come up with this wonderful UPI stack, which is really an architecture-led Marvel story in financial services industry, is everything is around APIs and other apps, right? So there's an entire new digital economy that is being built, which is around API and apps, and which brings to the forefront several ecosystem players. The large mega, private sector or public sector banks, to large mega, insurance companies, to very small niche fintech startups, right? Everything is getting integrated with APIs and apps, and services are getting consumed by third-party service providers to be able to create new offerings. And of course, this entire technology wave around, whether it's the blockchain and AI, machine learning, which is allowing you to do the kind of analytics and the kind of big data based on which you're able to target consumers and the services and the offerings. In all of this, there is increasing regulatory scrutiny, whether it is coming from, competition commissions, it's coming from the banking regulator, insurance regulator, capital markets regulator, then of course Ministry of Finance and Ministry of IT. There's increasing regulatory scrutiny on the financial services world and the fintech because they're pretty much, the rails of the economy runs on this, and everything is on digital channels now. And there is a lot of new emerging markets that these fintechs, and most of the fintechs which are innovating from India, are not just servicing Indian markets, they may be even servicing global markets. And one real trend we have seen is how everything is getting platformized. It's not something that each bank is doing or each insurance. If you look at a lot of the solutions on wealth management or aggregated services, the aggregators and the platform aggregators, which are offering a bouquet of services, which are probably cutting across channels, and the back-end institutions traverse multiple set of organizations. There's a lot of platformization. Even if you look at, I would say, what the UPI stack has done, it's a wonderful example of a public sector, public agency, really platformizing, financial inclusion and all the hooks where multiple ecosystem players are able to ride on the top of that platform. And in all of this, when you look at digitization, just to recap what I've already talked about, there's a lot around platformization of technology and the business models, because everything is getting, SaaS based and subscriber and user subscription based. There's a lot around the cloud that is happening, both public and private cloud. And when you look at all of this, increasingly, even very traditional large monolithic banks are now looking at anything new that is coming up. They're looking at a mobile first strategy, right? Everything is getting offered on the mobile through apps. Whereas in the past, we have seen that it was all a conventional, internet-based solutions where most of the access to service to the consumers was browser based, whereas increasingly we are seeing mobile and pretty much a mobile first strategy for anything new that any financial services institution in India is launching, and because of which the way they authenticate, the way they authorize, how do they integrate with the underlying mobile OSs is something that has got significantly radicalized in the last, I would say, 3 to 4 years time frame. Excuse me. So when you look at this kind of a rapid mainstreaming of emerging technologies into the financial services world, it's also cutting down the time cycles to be able to develop, deploy, test, and then launch a service, right? Pretty much maybe the past, if it was taking 18 to 24 months time frame, now CIOs and CTOs and CISOs are looking at a 3 to 4 months time frame. And when we look at all of this, there is also the volume of data. If you look at the kind of transactions that would have happened on the core banking platform or the internet banking or even the mobile banking versus when wallets got launched and the UPI got launched, and then a host of services were riding on top of UPI. Just look at the numbers that NPCI or RBI publishes, the volumes of transactions and also the value of the transactions. They just keep, excuse me, I seem to have a bad cold. The volumes and the value of the transactions and the volumes of the transactions are just getting accentuated by the day and the hour. And in all of this, while you do all of this, there are expectations of retaining the trust, because if there is any breach, if there is any negligence in the security and the privacy best practices that the organization, and it's not just within your organization, because whenever you're offering a digital service in the financial services world, I would challenge any organization to say that they're able to do end-to-end on their own. It's always a bunch of ecosystem players who are coming together to be able to offer this service. So a bank may be, partnering with card issuing companies. They're partnering with an NPCI. They may be partnering with a fintech. They may be partnering with a digital payments bank. They might be partnering with a micro lending firm, right? So it is always when you're ultimately offering a service to the consumer. I'm sure there's a lot of core that you do everything end to end yourself, but it is a bunch of ecosystem players who are coming together. Even if you look at the wealth management companies, you look at the loan processing companies, the TPAs, it's always an ecosystem of companies. In all of this, you're expected to make sure that you mitigate all the risks of both security and privacy and make sure that there is no breach. And whenever there is that kind of a breach, and you need to do it at every points of data, right from collection to processing to the way you store it. Sometimes you're leveraging cloud-based platforms. It's something that you're doing on-premise. Sometimes it may be third-party providers, right? In all of this, the risks that you deal with is hyper-digitization, obviously leads to profitability, servicing consumers, happy consumers, maybe bringing down the price point of the kind of services that you're able to offer. That's what technology has brought in. But it also brings in any kind of a breach, particularly whether it's a data protection or a security or a privacy breach, the kind of brand reputation, regulation scrutiny. And we've seen examples of sometimes, a sudden user-based erosion. A company takes months and years to be able to build its consumer base. So how do we go ahead and do all of this? I would say there is one mindset could be is that I follow the law of the land. I find out all the regulations that all my financial services regulators are putting, or the government of India is putting, or the state government is putting. I will comply to it, and I do tick boxes in the entire checklist that I have drafted with the help of some consulting company. I think that would be, from in my humble opinion, that is now simply a hygiene factor. That's a base level of your preparedness for security and privacy with the kind of data that you're dealing with, right? I think if you have an approach where consumer trust is centric to the way you design your products, services, and your technology solutions and deployment strategies, and the way you go the services online, if it's based around retaining that consumer trust, I think for the future readiness, we will be better off in terms of the kind of checks and balances, the way you deploy technology, the way you select technology to be able to protect your data and security. Some of the regulatory policy trends that we are seeing is one thing that we are seeing is this account aggregator concept that's really picking up in India, because of which then you will see again a lot of third-party collaboration where your systems are getting opened up through APIs, through other players in the ecosystem. Some of them could be global companies, some of them could be, your service providers, your technology partners, or it could also be some, very niche fintech innovators. Thankfully, while worldwide we've been seeing a lot of regulators coming up with sandboxes for speeding up the testing and deployment cycles. The regulatory sandboxes are a welcome measure because regulations have always have been at a certain pace, whereas the technology innovation has always been pacing at a very rapid clip. So how do you make sure those regulatory? There are some early examples. I think we still need to do more. Thankfully, some of the financial services institutions regulators have started talking about it, have provisioned this, but I think it's not enough. We need to do a lot more. And another thing that we are seeing, particularly in the financial services world, is the pace at which regulations are coming up and the time window for industry members to be able to comply with that, whether it's banks, whether it's card companies, and maybe sometimes in the also very young innovators from the fintech world. So how do we build a technology solutions which are agile enough that we can rapidly get ready to any regulations, because the time window in which a regulation is coming out, is getting announced, and the window for compliance, I think, is getting cut down drastically. Globally, now, before we get into what is expected and the best practices in terms of privacy, some trends that we are seeing is a lot of rigor that is expected around anonymization, because it's not, when you're dealing with personal data, it is no longer good enough to say I have anonymized it and I have made sure that the personal identifiers are removed. Those constructs are being significantly challenged. They're being challenged by regulators, they're being challenged by academia, they're being challenged by civil society and by users. So what is the kind of rigor in anonymization so that potentially personal data cannot be de-identified, and what really are the technologies that you're following? Similarly, a minimum expectation is privacy by design. It's no longer a buzzword. I think that's a minimum expectation, and increasingly we are seeing mobile apps that are being launched on the platforms trying to bake in this because of the user expectations and also sometimes maybe the regulatory guidelines that are coming up. And increasingly, governments and regulators are asking, just like there used to be annual statutory audit for financial accounts and for security, there is an expectation that there is a data protection impact assessment. And even our draft bill is expecting that on an annual basis. So data protection and a privacy impact assessment could be something add-on, and it's not just a cybersecurity or a financial audit. So an organization needs to build that kind of maturity to be able to do this and not look at it like a compliance burden. Most regulators are coming up with hefty fines and also, remedies to the consumers whenever there is a grievance and the grievance is found to be valid. That's another thing. Many regulators are coming up with restrictions on data transfers. Maybe for some kind of data, like for example, some country may be saying that health data cannot be transferred outside, or some other, maybe genetic data cannot be transferred outside. So different regulators are coming up with different expectations, and you need to comply to that, which means your entire deployment strategy, when you're coming up with a new technology solution, you need to think through this deployment strategy so that it doesn't break down when a new regulation comes up. I think you need to build that, whereas previously we might have had a certain way to do it, but now you need to have the agility in not just the development and the technology innovation you're doing, also have that agility in what your deployment strategy is, so that if a new regulation comes up which puts some restrictions on data transfers, am I agile enough to be able to take care of is my deployment models agile enough to be able to take care of that? And many, just like, many years back, there was a mandate that an organization as a CIO or a CISO, increasingly an office of a DPO or whatever they call, Chief Privacy Officer or Data Protection, the name may not be very important. And just like we had, Department of Justice in the US giving a lot of attention to data-related matters and trust-related matters, we are beginning to see competition regulators look at everything to do with data and privacy. So it's not just the sectoral regulator or an overall national regulator, but regulators of competition and trust are also giving a lot of attention. In all of this, we need to understand that we need to come up with some at an enterprise level, if you're particularly a financial services institution, which has always been a regulated sector, which has a lot more attentions from their governments and their central banks and any other regulator that comes into the picture, capital markets, right? How do you mitigate those privacy risks? All I would say is, if this mitigation strategy is not compliance centric and is a best practices way, and you look at it, you don't really need India's PDP bill for a large financial services enterprise to tell you what are the best practices for privacy implementation, right? 99% of it you can know, maybe 1 or 2% will be something unique to the PDP bill which you have to take care. But if you look at the overall privacy principles and best practices, and from a user expectation perspective, the trust, your own brand reputation, a lot of it is already known, nothing is new. I don't think there's anything new that PDP bill will reveal. So I would say look at this from a best practices perspective and craft your strategies and start your data protection or privacy implementation program. And many large banks and financial services institutions are not waiting for the law. They've already started on this. Once the draft bill came, many of them have started their journey, even when EU GDPR was coming, saying that if Europe is coming up this way, I'm sure at some point India will come up with a strong privacy regulation, and many banks have already established those privacy teams. So it's extremely important that financial services institution looks at the entire journey of the personal data. Where exactly is it being collected, processed, where does it traverse across the life cycle of that user that you're servicing, right from the first cold call you may be making or the first onboarding, moment of truth to the entire life cycle of the consumer. Of course, you need a regulatory compliance intelligence. Typically, the regulatory compliance of what the Ministry of Company Affairs is saying or what a SEBI is saying, I'm talking from an India perspective, same thing will happen if you're a US listed company. Tracking what, SEC is saying or what the central bank is saying or what Fed is saying comes naturally to an enterprise. But keeping a regulatory track of what are the evolving privacy regulations in other geographies, what is coming from a financial services sector in another big markets, which potentially at some point of time will impact India. I think that having that intelligence so that there is a team within the enterprise which is constantly looking at it. I'm sure a large bank or a large insurance company at the leadership level, at the board level, is constantly looking at what's happening in that sectors in US or Europe or Brazil or Australia or wherever, right? That's natural to the DNA of any large enterprise. But how do you look at that same kind of a compliance from a data protection and privacy and a security perspective? I would urge that any financial services institution should have a core team which is also building this intelligence, not just about what's coming up or what's in a draft stage in the country in which you're headquartered, but in all the other markets that you may be servicing. Because at some point of time, the global regulatory compliances move from, tend to converge in different geographies. I would also say that when you do contracts, which could be contracts for your employees, it could be contracts that you're doing with third parties for servicing your consumers, have that lens of the privacy rigor, whether those contracts are having those enough data protection principles, privacy principles, if your users are protected, your employees are protected enough. When you do third party, just the way when you're contracting, maybe for your facilities management, for your headquarters building in BKC, or you're doing a big contract for your turnkey outsourcing for your core banking, I think that kind of rigor should come from a privacy standpoint when you're contracting with third parties and with any other suppliers in the ecosystem with whom you're partnering. Sometimes it could also be partnerships with your business partners. And of course, training and awareness for your end users, particularly your field staff who touch your consumers. And continuously, just like the way now there is so much maturity in the way security is implemented in large financial services institutions, and the way, thanks to all the security operations centers, the next gen SOCs that have got implemented, how every security incident is getting monitored with that kind of rigor through enabled by technology. How do we look at implementing some technology solutions though, so that privacy is also monitored, try and capture incidents which could potentially lead to a large scale privacy breach in the future? And how do you go ahead and secure that kind of information? In all of this, I think the fundamental principle for any large enterprise should be is how do you make sure that you cultivate the trust of your users and maybe all your partner organizations and demonstrate that accountability. I think it's not just enough you have a good privacy policy and you have implemented all the technology and the training. Demonstrating that you're giving attention to privacy and you mean what you're saying in your policy, and you can demonstrate that you're complying with the letter and spirit. And some of the accountabilities is not just the technical teams, but your leadership team, your sales teams, right? How do you make sure that you as continuously are assessing the risks for privacy and where could be some violations of the data protection principles that need to be done or privacy principles that you need to be able to do? And just like you have this entire risk governance framework, apply that same governance risk framework or make sure that privacy risk governance and compliance is baked into your overall enterprise risk and mitigation strategies. And when you look at building any new solution or offering on the digital stack, and when you're going online, going on mobile, I would say don't have a compliance mindset that my current regulation is not doing that. If you look at it from designing the solution from a user-centric point of view, I'm sure you'll more or less be able to comply to any current or even sometimes future regulation. The best practices and the privacy principles is what I would urge everyone. In terms of the personal data protection bill, because this is something that my team wanted me to cover because there's a broader audience here. There's an entire data taxonomy of sensitive and personal data. I don't need to get into it too much. The most important thing is that potentially any sensitive personal data, which includes in the current version of the bill, that is the 2019 version of the bill, which includes health data and financial data, can be declared as critical personal data, which means the bar for compliance and implementation from a protection standpoint is much higher for critical personal data. There is also expectations of anonymization, and there's a new section where anonymized data could potentially be requested to be shared. We are beginning to see some discourse around that in terms of non-personal data and the committee that is talking about it. We have to see what exactly would be the final shape of that committee's recommendations or the report that comes out. From a fintech standpoint, or building a technology solution in the financial services world, I would say that if you look at the current bill or if you look at regulations in other parts of the world too, there are the usual personal data or personally identifiable data. But if you look at the health data plus the financial data, that's really a bucket which it touches pretty much every user, every consumer, every citizen. And when you combine it with that official identifier, How do you go ahead and put that kind of protection rigor and the privacy principles, and maybe what kind of technology solutions you choose to be able to implement that kind of privacy. And when you look at the overall demographic information of a user classes, whatever that you can personally identify about that user, and when you combine it with financial data, which could be multiple transactions on the day, year, month, how do you go ahead and do that? So currently, the bill has financial data and health data, sensitive personal data. At least on financial data, we at DSCI and also NASCOM have made this submission that it should not ideally be in sensitive personal data. We need to see what would be the final shape of the bill, but we have made a submission on that. And when you have this entire financial data and health data, because several financial services institutions touch health data because of whether it's insurance and other kinds of instruments or products that they deal with, I think the bar for privacy implementation keeps growing higher and higher. So I don't need to really tell the team. And when you're building a technology solution, if you need to really look at the 2019 version of the PDP bill, the consent and the consent management becomes an extremely crucial way in which you design your product and your solution and the way you transact with your customer across the life cycle of the service offering and across the life cycle of that consumer, engaging with you. Because I think consent and explicit consent, particularly of sensitive personal data, is something that the bill is reinforcing and is reiterating quite a bit, and because of which, how do you manage this entire consent at different points of time when you're transacting with a consumer is something that usually when solutions have been built a few years back and which are continuing to be used, we have not given that kind of attention in terms of consent management and what is the nuances, and particularly if you're working with third party players, there could also be consent management aggregators that might come into the fold as the bill gets enacted and as enterprises think through how do you implement the bill for complete compliance. So consent management is one piece that really comes into the point because it's talking about explicit consent, and also maybe you need to obtain the consent all over again. So when you're designing that solution, have you given it enough thought on across the transaction life cycle and across the life cycle of the consumer? How do you manage this consent management? It's not a trivial problem for a solution architect or for an enterprise to deal with. It's not just a privacy problem, it's an overall technology solution architecting problem too. And another thing that comes to mind, which I think financial services organizations, including it could be a small fintech, right, need to look at the potential classification as a significant data fiduciary. There is this perception that significant data fiduciary can be maybe very large, technology companies and platform companies and internet economy companies or e-commerce companies. I would beg to differ on that, because if you look at what the current bill is saying, potentially there could be even a very small innovative fintech company which could potentially get classified as significant data fiduciary based on the way the provisions are listed in the current bill, because it could be volume of data. Maybe a small fintech is not doing it, but if you're a payment bank, the volume of data you're dealing with is as much as what a large bank is dealing with, right? May not be of the same league of the organization. Somebody is a 100-year-old organization, somebody is just a 2-year-old organization, but the volume of data is pretty much similar maybe. And the most important thing is the risk of harm from a privacy standpoint, because everything is online, everything is on the mobile front, cloud enabled, SaaSified, right? The risk of harm for processing of this data and the breach of the data, the harm that you can create. Most importantly, the use of new technologies. I would challenge any fintech. Is there any fintech in India which is not leveraging emerging technology, right? It could be either blockchain, it could be AI and machine learning, right? There's a lot around cognitive computing, integration with biometrics for authentication, right? So when you look at all of this, almost all financial services institutions and fintechs leverage. So potentially, you could be meeting this bar of significant data fiduciary. Based on which, if you look at it, when you're a significant data fiduciary, the expectations of compliance, whether it is having a data protection officer, registering with the DPA, conducting annual data protection assessments, all of this needs to be given a thought. I mean, I frankly don't know what would be the final version of the bill that will get tabled, but with the current version, every financial services institution or a fintech company can potentially be classified as a significant data fiduciary. So I urge people to give this importance when you're looking at crafting the bill. Data principle, one is the regulator side, fines and all of that. I think large enterprises, it's in their DNA to look at regulatory compliance. But how do you look at having a user-centric approach? Because there are significant rights and remedies that are being granted to the user, which is the data principle, which is your user or consumer. And the most important thing is expectations of portability. So if this right for data portability is given, so if you're a bank, you're a payment bank, you're a micro lending company, if there is an expectation of portability, how will you enable that? And also correction and erasure and access to the data. I think providing access, maybe correction is something that they can deal with, but data portability or erasure of data is something that needs to be. And there are some expectations of currently for sensitive personal data, that data needs to be resident in India. And if it is declared as critical personal data, potentially bars against transfer of data outside. Financial services institutions need to also look at other regulatory guidelines that are in this direction, which means your entire data storage, deployment, architectures, strategies that you're building for not only your current infrastructure and your current solution, but for anything new that you're designing needs to be able to take care of this. Some of the impact, I'm just summarizing that. I would say I've already talked about consent. Because of the correction and right to correction and all of that that you need to offer, what are you implementing in terms of data quality so that you don't get caught by user grievances and personal remedies issue, and the consent management framework and how will you platformize it or how will you implement it across your various channels is something that you need to look at. So if there are any questions, Deval, I'm happy to take that. This is my panel.
No, thank you, Rama, for sharing these insights and thoughts with us. I think it's pretty relevant, topical, and precise to our point. I think we have just time for one question. I think there's one question which has come. There are two questions which has come from the audience. Let me share the first one. I mean, you spoke about in your previous slides about various new technologies that are coming up, right? I mean, be it blockchain, be it IoT, be it crypto, right? But whenever, or even cloud, right? But whenever these new technologies are coming up, the cyber criminals are ahead of the curve, and usually, it's the regulators and the enforcement agencies are playing catch up, right?
Yeah.
So, in your opinion, how can regulators and enforcement agencies, preempt some of the things, because many of these technologies are existing globally, right? And thereby they can have an upper hand, or at least some sort of framework ready, so that they can combat such activities. So what's your view on this question?
I think cybercrime and cybersecurity breaches will continue to happen. There is always a dark side of technology, and there are enough and more cyber criminals, particularly financial services sector has always been a critical sector across the world. They've been the most targeted. Maybe now there are other sectors who are also being targeted, but financial services sector has always been the one of the largest targets of cyber criminals. I think the only thing that you can do is continuously raise the bar of your security implementation, both from a standpoint of people capability and the technology capability. And it needs to be now escalated into the most enterprise, the biggest risk for an enterprise. So the moment if you elevate cyber risk to an enterprise risk level, I think the budgets that are needed for technology implementation, continuously refresh what are the new platforms and products that can be done, and collaboration with the regulators, because even if you look at in India, the attention that has come to cybersecurity from the regulators starting from 2016-17 onwards, we see a tremendous maturity among the banks, the way the CISO function is now getting empowered. So I think it's not just the regulatory attention, but the board level attention. It's good to see a lot of boards giving now importance to cyber risk as much as any other enterprise risk they may be dealing with. And if you look at it from a national standpoint, national nodal organizations, like whether it is CERT and others, collaborating with other CERTs, so that there is continuous country level threat intelligence, sectoral level threat intelligence, and a company level threat intel. I think company level threat intel and sectoral level has started scaling up, at least in financial services world, that has scaled up thanks to the strong regulator that we have in the banking sector and others. And at the country level, I would like to believe that given the kind of state actors and the kind of risk that we are seeing from state actors, I think there's a continuous stepping up. So we need to have this threat intel scaled up at a country level, sectoral level, and a company level, and a threat intel sharing, and of course, the adequate budgets to look at implementing a robust security platform and a technology-led security.
No, sure. Rightly said, ma'am. In fact, one of our keynote speakers today said that you should have a cybersecurity chief on your board, and the CEO should have a distinct KPI on cybersecurity and cyber rating of an organization. So I think same views. I think it's a collaborative effort by all stakeholders, including corporate and the government. But thank you very much for sharing your insights and sharing your thoughts. I think with that, I would like to conclude the session. Thank you, ma'am, once again. Over to you, Sriraj.
Thank you, Deval.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much, sir and ma'am, for sparing time for such an engaging discussion. And another thank you to attendees as well who are here with us today. Thank you so much, everyone. We'll be back shortly with the next session. Please stay tuned.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.